Why were the Irish not considered white when they first immigrated to the United States? It would be inaccurate to say that Irish folks were ever suffering the same indignities and dehumanization as Black or Indigenous folks on that ranking system of white supremacy, but they definitely weren't right at the top with whiteness. And we can see this under the myth of Irish enslavement. Irish folks were never enslaved under chattel slavery the same way that African folks were. Irish people did have to endure forced labor, but it wasn't passed on by a matter of them being Irish. In 1662, there was a law in the Virginia colonies called Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which basically said that if a woman is enslaved and she's an African woman, then her children are automatically enslaved under a condition of being Black. What the Irish suffered in the United States was called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a system of forced labor where the person had a contract and was usually indentured or forced to work without pay in order to repay a debt. So yes, it was slavery, but it wasn't chattel slavery because you could not buy, sell, or trade an indentured servant. You could buy their debts and then have them work for you to repay that debt, but it was totally different than chattel slavery, but it was still messed up. Indentured servitude and chattel slavery were both outlawed in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, except as a punishment for crime, which is a whole other conversation to be had. Both systems were horrible, but there's a little difference in the amount of oppression and the racialized context behind them. So when we say that Irish people were not white, what we're actually saying is that they didn't have the same privileges afforded by white supremacy that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and other white peoples from Europe were afforded. Irish people in the United States faced ethnic, classist, religious, and xenophobic discrimination. That's true. But the way that Irish people were assimilated into whiteness or finally viewed as accepted into whiteness is a really interesting history too. It's also a little racist. Race is a construct or a human invention that was created to rank and differentiate and separate people based on our natural human differences. Natural human differences are real, like differences in our skin tone, hair texture, facial features, etc., but that's not what race is. Race is all of the politics and meaning associated and tied to those. As Dr. Dorothy Roberts says, race is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. When you're categorized by the system that is race, you are racialized, and people have been racialized differently depending on what the politics and society that have been controlling our behavior needed at the time. Starting in around the 1840s, Irish people were subjected to similar racialization and stereotypes that Black people were, saying who was and wasn't desirable, who acted uncivilized, and other things of that nature that are incredibly racist. From the jump in the US, Irish folks were allowed to go to white-only spaces, were allowed to marry and have children with other white people, but the issue here really is that they didn't have the same privileges and rights as other white folks. Irish folks already had an incredible amount of passing privilege, meaning that they would be perceived as white until it was maybe demonstrated that they were Catholic instead of Protestant, or that they started speaking with an accent. An excellent book that talks about all of this is called How the Irish Became White, and I recommend reading it. Ever since 1878, literal US courts have litigated the issue of whether certain groups are white or not. The unfortunate fact about how Irish folks became white in the context of the US is that they started contributing to the oppression of Black Americans. It's kind of difficult to articulate, but essentially, early Irish immigrants started to demonstrate that they could be more harsh and more brutal in their treatment of Black Americans than the people who were already considered white. This happened during chattel slavery, where many Irish immigrants did not own slaves, but became overseers and essentially carried out the will of the slave-owning masters. And then this continued in places like New York and Boston, where Irish immigrants became in control of the police force. By organizing politically and becoming tools of white supremacy, Irish folks were allowed to assimilate into whiteness. Irish American history provides a pretty unique example about how permeable and inconsistent the rules of white supremacy can be. So while today Irish folks are perceived to be white, even that's problematic because not everyone in Ireland is white. A person's perceived or actual connection to whiteness, as well as the extent to which they uphold white supremacy, are all privileged in the system that we exist in, which is white supremacy. Checking and using our privilege, as well as learning our actual history and why we have these categories in the first place, are all phenomenal tactics to start disrupting white supremacy. This is not about being ashamed of your history or trying to rewrite it. It's about knowing the truth and learning how it affects your present.